Okay, we have the last two sections. This will be a pretty short video on what happens if we're not undergoing cellular respiration. And so we talked about glycolysis was the first part of cellular respiration, where you took the glucose and you split it apart and you ended up with two ATPs, you knitted two ATPs, and you made two pyruvates. And we said that it was anaerobic, it didn't need oxygen. And then to go on to the next step, to go on to citric acid cycle, to the intermediate step in citric acid cycle, you needed oxygen to shuttle into the mitochondria. If you did not, this happens. So this is fermentation. That is where we're at here. Um, and this is where we are going to take those pyruvates, take those molecules and break them down. So if we have pyruvates and we couldn't shuttle them to the citric acid cycle, if we didn't have oxygen, what happens with the pyruvates? So it can change. We can still change those pyruvates and change them into something else with fermentation. Typically, fermentation is going to produce gas when metabolism happens. In this case, when we're anaerobic and we take the pyruvates and we don't have the oxygen, in in people, we are going to take those pyruvates and it changes. So our pyruvates, here's our NADH going to NAD, and they are going to lose that hydrogen. So if you lose your hydrogen, you're losing your electron, so you are oxidized. So our pyruvate and our NAD is oxidized, NADH is oxidized, turns into NAD, and now we go from pyruvate and we end up with lactate. We end up with lactic acid. So this can happen in people if you are working out real hard. Maybe you are in high intensity. Yeah, maybe you're doing a hit workout and you're working out really hard, really hard, really hard, really hard, really hard, and you use up all of the available oxygen for your maybe you're doing squats. Maybe you're doing squats over and over and over again, squats or burpees, and you are burning up the oxygen in your quads. And eventually you're going to use up that oxygen and your muscles are still trying to move. They're still trying to do what you're asking them to do, but you've used up all the available oxygen. You're still creating pyruvate with glycolysis, but now you don't have the oxygen. So what happens to that pyruvate? It turns into lactic acid, and this stuff eventually builds up in your muscles and it leads to muscle fatigue. It's part of the reason why you have sore muscles when you have a hard workout. You got to work that lactic acid out of those muscles. So that is a form of fermentation where we take the pyruvates and we're going to take the hydrogens from the NADH molecule and we produce lactic acid at the end. Other forms of fermentation are when we can produce alcohol. So here we have our pyruvate, and it is going to be changed into, here's pyruvate acid, it's going to be changed into acetaldehyde. But when we change it to acetaldehyde, it's going to give off gas, it's going to produce CO2, just like we talked about in our citric acid cycle producing CO2. Alcohol fermentation produces CO2. It's going to off gas CO2. We're going to take that acetaldehyde and then we're going to take the hydrogens from our NADH and we're going to end up producing ethanol. So from pyruvic acid, we produce acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde then can be changed into ethanol, a type of alcohol. So if you were producing wine, producing beer, even kombucha, if you like kombucha, has a little bit of alcohol in it. If you notice on the label, if you've ever had kombucha, it's kind of good. It's an acquired taste. Um, but it is a form of fermentation. You start with, the mother and you use that to produce and grow um, and ferment more alcohol with the different bacteria that you've got in there producing this stuff, yeast for beer and wine and stuff like that. So this is fermentation, and its byproduct is alcohol. It will off gas CO2 and produce alcohol at the end. So if you enjoy a beverage of your choice, beer, wine, whatever, most of that is produced with alcohol. Other things are also produced with fermentation. If you enjoy yogurt and cheeses, those are fermented things. Kimchi and pickles, all of that stuff are produced by fermentation. So there's amazing stuff out there, and you can thank bacteria and eukaryotic little yeasts for those products because they are quite delicious and tasty. The very last, more anaerobic respiration. And does an animal or not, does that bacteria, does that organism, maybe it's an archaea, does it, excuse me, ooh, excuse me, does it need oxygen or not? Is something, we have two terms that we'll cover here. There's facultative and there's obligate. Facultative and obligate. And I like to differentiate the two, facultative and obligate. If you have an obligation, you have to do it, right? You're obliged, you have to do this thing. You have an obligation and you got to do it. So obligate anaerobes, like here in this growth pattern picture, obligate anaerobes have to be in an environment without oxygen. They are anaerobic, they don't want oxygen, and they have to be that way. So they grow best at the bottom of your tube, away from the oxygen that's going to be at the top of the tube. Those are obligate anaerobes. Your facultative anaerobes can take it or leave it. It's a wishy-washy. Yes or no, so. I kind of like it, whatever. That's a facultative anaerobe. So they could live without oxygen, but they can handle the oxygen too. So you may see them growing up here at the top where the oxygen is, but you're going to see them also in areas without. These are facultative anaerobes. What about an aerobe? Obligate aerobe is something that has to have oxygen. So you're going to only see them at the top of the tube. There are aerotolerant anaerobes. This is more micro than you need to know for 1010, but it's in here in this picture, so I'm going to explain it. And aerotolerant anaerobes, they don't need oxygen at all, but they are tolerant of it. Unlike our obligate anaerobes, these guys, they cannot tolerate oxygen. There are bacteria out there that if they are exposed to oxygen, it'll kill them, they'll die. So they have to live at the bottom. Obligate, aerotolerant anaerobes, they're not bothered by it, so they can live with wherever. They are anaerobes, they don't need it, and if they're around it, it doesn't bother them, so they can just leave wherever. And then microaerophiles, this is again a micro terminology, and y'all don't need to know this, but with microaerophiles, they can tolerate the oxygen, but in low levels. So they grow best a little below the surface, and not right at the surface. I need y'all to understand obligate anaerobes are these guys living at the bottom. They have to live at the bottom because they cannot tolerate the oxygen. They have to live in an anaerobic environment. And an example of that is Clostridium tetani that causes you tetanus. That bacteria, it lives in the soil and it will produce these little spores, endospores. And then if one of those endospores gets into your wound, like you stepped on a nail, a rusty nail that's been out there for a while, and that nail injects those endospores into your body way down deep in the tissue, then that can possibly give you tetanus. And hopefully you all have the tetanus shot and you've got the vaccination and you're fine. But these guys thrive in an anaerobic environment, deep in the tissues, not right at the surface of your wound, can possibly give you Clostridia tetani if you got a deep wound because they are obligate anaerobes. They like environments without air. Where facultative anaerobes, they can switch between oxygen or not. They don't really care. They'll go back and forth. So facultative, wishy-washy. Obligate, has to. Aerobic needs oxygen. Anaerobic does not need oxygen. Some things are going to reduce different things. So we said we had our NADHs and our FADHs, and we're going to take those oxygens, and then the oxygen, we're going to take those hydrogens off of the NADs and the FADs, and we're going to take those hydrogens and we're going to combine them with our oxygen with oxidative phosphorylation, and we are going to make water at the end. Oxygen is our final electron receptor, and it's going to combine with the hydrogens and produce water as one of the byproducts of cellular respiration. You could reduce other things. There are bacteria out there that reduce other things. So some of them bacteria out there reduce sulfate. So that is these guys, the green, this stuff right here. These are sulfate reducers. Bacteria are cool. Archaea and prokaryotes, archaea and bacteria. The prokaryotes are cool and amazing. And I told y'all that they are cool and amazing because they were here first. Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and these suckers have been around for 4 billion years. They have colonized all the places. They have figured out all the cool tricks, all the hacks. They know them all and they are living them. So they're not all restricted to an anaerobic environment. They may like aerobic environment. They're not restricted to just glucose or just the sun's energy. Maybe they can do something else and find another chemical energy source. They're everywhere. They figured out all the hacks and I think they're really amazing. So if you have the chance and you want to take micro, they're pretty fascinating creatures. Moving on to the very last section. Um, how do we use other things in our metabolic pathways? For cellular respiration, we talked about glucose. Glucose is the molecule. We love sugar, we love glucose. It's easy to break down, it's easy to store away in our short term energy storage with glycogen as a polysaccharide. We love it. But we can also use other sources for energy. So we talked about polysaccharides were produced by little monomers called monosaccharides. We talked about lipids were another energy source, and they had their fatty acid chains and their glycerol heads. So we could use some of those. If you know somebody, hopefully you do not know somebody. If you have seen pictures of people that are in situations that are food deprived and they are starving, if you have seen pictures of somebody like that suffering from this, the body first goes for the sugars. Your sugar stored in your muscles and your liver, your sugar stored up there. It's going to go for those first. And then when it runs out of those immediate, instant, short term energy sources of the sugars, it's going to go after the fats, your fat stores. That's why, bears store on the pack on the fat for hibernating because that's your long term energy storage. And if your fats run out, then eventually your body starts tearing down your proteins too. So if you've seen pictures of people that are literally starving, they have no fat reserves and their body is starting to attack their muscle and they become skin and bones because we can use proteins and proteins are built out of amino acids. So some of those amino acids can be plugged and chugged into the citric acid cycle. I told y'all not to worry about the intermediates, but we can create some of those intermediates from the amino acids from our proteins. If we were breaking down our muscle because we were starving, we could use that for cellular respiration. Some of those amino acids can go into that pyruvate oxidation. Some of the amino acids can be produced. We can use glycerol and have that produce glycolysis and used in glycolysis. So we can use sugars, yes, sugars, glucose for citric acid cycle, for cellular respiration. Yes, yes, we love sugars. But we can also use proteins. We can also use fats. We can snap off the fatty acid chains, and we can snap off those carbons and snap those off and produce ATP off of the fat molecules too. You can actually get about 50 something, 51, 52-ish ATP molecules by breaking down fat. But if somebody was on a keto diet, for example, and they were low carbing it and using fat, um, the problem with breaking down fat is that it doesn't often get broken down completely and that it can leave ketones behind, and those can accumulate and possibly make you acidic. And your body can combat this. Normal people with a healthy immune system and healthy kidneys and liver are being able to overcome ketoacidosis. But that can happen if your fats are your sole energy source and they're breaking down so quickly that you can't break down the whole thing completely. You end up with these ketones left over. But we can use fats as energy sources. We can use proteins as energy sources, and we can plug them into the glycolysis step, into the pyruvate oxidation citric acid cycle, um, leading to the last step of oxidative phosphorylation. So there are other energy sources. It's not just sugar. We can use lipids, we can use fats, and we can use proteins in these different pathways. So that's my big takeaway for chapter 4. If you have questions on these, I know that it is complicated. Please look through the outlines, understand those 3 big steps for cellular respiration, understand the name of it, where it's happening, is it aerobic or not aerobic, what's getting produced. Um, each of the 3 steps. Those are the 4 takeaways I want you to know about those 3 steps. Know your boldface terms. Go through your study guides and let me know if you have any questions on chapter 4. Have a great day.